Hey, what's up everybody? This is going to be the daily recap of the MPL MY Season 12. We're going to be covering all the games that have happened over the weekend, and this is only week 1, so don't expect too many crazy things, but there were interesting moments in these games. So let's dive into it. Day number 1, week number 1, we see Alice Jungle by Todak in game number 1. In this matchup, we already noticed a couple of big glaring issues. Number 1, the fact that their front line isn't as strong as you would like them to be. Plenty of appeal. The idea is there. However, when we look at Team SMG's response to the overall draft, you can clearly see that it's all about slowing down this Alice Jungle. And I think this is a pretty good example of how not to play Alice Jungle, especially if you don't want to play for that late game and you feel like you can capitalize on these earlier to mid game situations, which a lot of the times Alice Jungles need to sacrifice in order to power farm, walk through lanes, and pick up those blood orbs as soon as she can to get to at least 120 stacks before she is somewhat relevant. 80 stacks is pretty good. 60 stacks, you already start to feel yourself getting stronger. But once you hit 120, you know it's go time from then on out. So it's an interesting game to keep your eyes on. While you're checking out the SMG versus Todak matchup, I think it's a good shout out to actually look at game number 3 on top of game number 1, right? With the experimentations being very, very extreme for Todak's side. I mean, it's Todak, it's part of their brand, right? They like to experiment, so they did it in this series against their previous rivals of the grand finals of season 11. Who better to test it out on, right? They decide to go for the Jungle Natan and Mincetar Gold. Now, it's clear that they want to punish Sasa with this Mincetar Gold, and they still need scaling at the end of the day, so why not play Natan? They have plenty of peel in this lineup with good set mages, as well as throwing a Martis fake out in the draft to kind of throw the scent off this Natan jungle towards the last phases of the draft. So I would have to say that Todak set this up very nicely. It's just that the execution in the game itself got heavily punished, with a lot of the problems being the fact that Valentina is just really, really good, and SMG has very strong fundamentals. So with the standard comp of Edith, Wanwan, Valentina, Fredrin, and as well as the X-Borg to not only peel and kind of control the way these team fights actually go in terms of pacing, Team SMG eventually comes up on top. But I still think it's a pretty interesting watch. There was a lot of interesting moments specifically coming in from Todak's Natan where it feels like this might actually work. Which brings us to day number 2. Now, day number 2, a lot of interesting things happened as well. If you were wondering about the Lunatix situation, I'm not talking about it here. A lot of it has been concluded, and I'm here to kind of watch the games more than anything else rather than eat popcorn and enjoy the drama. But if you are a Lunatix hater, you might actually like this, because this time round, SRG took full advantage of every tool that they had regarding information on their ex-player Esha Ohana. In game number 2, it's very clear that both Zakus and Esha Ohana, it's not like they have a limited hero pool, considering that 5 dedicated bans towards supports, or at the very least heroes, that both Zakus as well as Esha Ohana have played professionally. Just take it away, just like that, gone. And they took full advantage of it, especially when SRG picks up the Valentina, forcing them onto a Diggy, making sure that their entire pickoff composition just was not good enough against a time journey that they technically brought themselves. It was big stonks coming in from SRG, but it just shows Coach Arcadia, he does his work, or Zoravekian as well as Sky Dreamer put in the effort, well, I would say the extra bit of effort for these target bans, but hey, you know, it's an interesting situation to be in. If you wanted to see an all-out war between 2 contenders who are looking to actually make it all the way to the grand finals and book their slots for M5, it's got to be RSG versus the Homebois. Now, both sides definitely had a little bit of adjustments in their own lineups as well as their internal staff, but I think it doesn't really take away the quality and level of gameplay that we saw here today, week 1, day number 2. To start things off, the Homebois coming in strong with, again, more imports coming into their side. Ryzel in particular has been a phenomenal player. I think he definitely fits the overall I would say culture, but also just the attitude that Homebois brings to the table. They benefit from his aggression. They even encourage him to be aggressive, and more importantly so, with Ryzel's overall situational game awareness, he knows when he can actually keep pushing forward when the rest of his team needs to back away. So I think that definitely helps out the Homebois, but then we jump back to RSG, who has two big names. Again, the biggest one coming in from Demon Kite, moving from RSG PH, jumping over to RSG MY. Bit of a risky move, because you would imagine that communication was going to be very evidently bad on their side, but it actually works out quite well. Demon Kite adjusted very well to how RSG is overall, and obviously it's not the smoothest transition in the world, but you can't expect it since it's so early on in the season, and they've only had so much time to practice, so I can only imagine that Demon Kite is going to get better. But one thing's for certain, RSG's early game is devastating when Demon Kite is that far ahead. Unfortunately, he was playing the Martis, so he doesn't scale as nicely in comparison to a high scaling jungler like Aulus, for an example. But then again, is that really Demon Kite's style? He's really up in your face, and make sure that you are not low on life, because his decimates, he will not let you run away without securing a kill. To pick off where we left off, Ryzel's debut was incredible, right? He comes into this game, you're expecting him to kind of do okay, mediocre. He came from MDL Alter Ego X, has won a championship MDL title with Alter Ego X, and then the season after only getting a runner-up place. But I think with his overall mechanics with the Homebois, I think it's definitely a step up with a much higher ceiling in comparison to his counterpart Anip, who had to sit out of this matchup. There's a lot to learn from these little things that he does, such as, in a lot of these games, marksmen don't necessarily want to push up forward, especially when you're already up on kills, but Homebois know how to snowball this out of control, turning what seemed to be a very small punishment into a devastating blow for RSG. Many times throughout this series, we see that RSG is taking full control over the early game to only get punished later on by the Homebois. And I think, it's very clear that Chibi was not having the best time throughout this series, but at the very end is when it matters. Game number 3, we see that first off, Homebois deciding to go for a lineup that's a little bit more comfortable to them. They start taking away comfort picks away from RSG, and they totally abuse them with it. And not to mention that Warlord decided to go for Sicilian, which we don't usually see, especially in this kind of meta, right? It kind of fulfills the same exact roles of Yve, Farsa, where you want to have some form of zone control, but still scale really hard towards the later stages of the game. But with Sicilian, he brings a different dynamic to the team composition in general, looking to kind of sustain, hit from afar, but more importantly so, let the front line do what they want to do, and in case anybody wants to jump in towards that back line, they can fall back onto the Sicilian, bat impacting from afar and making sure that he can kind of approach the situation more carefully rather than having to, oh, I have to use my ultimate here, I have to hold my abilities. It gives him the freedom and flexibility to kind of do what he wants, which is very helpful for a team as flexible as the Homebois. Next up, we have Hanzo lovers rejoice.
The Hanzo god returns!
As we see Hanzo come back in towards the meta, and that's unfortunately not the case, because instead it gets banned out, and in replacement, we see MPXN go for Sun Jungle.
What?
Yes, you heard me correct. Sun Jungle played... It's never been played in the jungle before, okay? Anip from the Homebois is the only person who's brave enough to bring it into the gold lane, and that makes a little bit more sense. But to put him in the jungle, I was not happy with that. Let me just tell you, I was not happy with the results, and MPXN really felt that, with Team HAQ taking full advantage of them, right? No neutral control. They can't really do too much in game number 1, especially since that their lanes were already losing, and with a couple of misplays, it became very evident that Team HAQ there was pretty much no way that they could actually lose that match. As we jump in towards game 2 and game 3, that's when you start to see that teams they gotta stop doing this. They gotta stop doing this. They get a little experimental, right? With information at hand, when you have a Valentina, I think game number 2 as well as game number 3 are very clear examples of how mid lane is so volatile right now, especially when it is influenced by the draft. There's not a lot of mage heroes that actually fit the meta as of right now, and more importantly, to benefit the compositions that are strongest in the meta as well. Probably something that a lot of teams need to start thinking about, because number one, when we see Valentina, do you really want to give some priority ultimates back over to them, especially if you are a pick-off composition? And that's what we see in game number 2 with Faramis already Valentina already locked in within the first phase of the draft. It's strange to see that they actually had to fall back on Faramis from the side of Team HAQ, which really hurt them. It really hurt them, and that's when they lost the game, bringing the score 1-1, and that's when we see game number 3, where Team HAQ instead goes for the Valentina and then punishes this Yve at the very end after banning out pretty much all the relevant mages in the meta as of yet, except for Farsa, which probably wouldn't have had a good time anyway, already locking in the Lapu Lapu and final picking the Kufra within blue side, which means that they had to finish off their composition before red side decided to lock in their hero, which all they were left with was Yve. And even then, you can only imagine that it felt like this is a big losing scenario. There's just nothing much they can really do about it. Whoever presses their ult first essentially loses the fight even before it even starts. So keep in mind that the mid lane, as of right now in the meta, kind of in a volatile spot with not as many picks overall in comparison to gold as well as EXP. I would say even jungle as well as that point. Why not, right? The very final matchup that I want to highlight to you guys here is to show you another side of Team Lunatix. Starting off in day number 1 wasn't very good for them. Sorry, day number 2, it wasn't looking very good for them. But coming to game number 3, they really pulled themselves together, coming up with some very interesting drafts, but I think more importantly so, it kind of shows that the skill level of the team is actually a lot higher than what we would have imagined, and more so after their brand name being tarnished with the situation that they had with their Myanmar players. But with their Malaysian lineup, at the very least, what we can see is that, well, at least they're willing to bring out some interesting things. Number 1, Hanzo Jungle in game number 1 versus the Homebois on day number 3, week number 1. Now, it's an interesting composition that they decided to line up here, because in game number 1, they go for the Hanzo Lunox Gold as their pair. Now, why did they bring out Lunox Gold? Most likely because if they choose anything else, if they decide to go for the carry, if they decide to go for the Beatrix even, it probably wouldn't have been enough. I mean, Homebois were able to pick up Beatrix for themselves to further lock out the Lunatix, and it's really disincentivizing to actually want to go for the carry when you're so short-ranged against a lineup of, well, Franco, Sicilian, that's already pretty rough, Edith, and as well as Fredrin. So as soon as you get touched by any single amount of CC being a carry, you're basically dead, because Homebois would probably never let you go. To supplement the overall lineup, Lunatix pairs up both the Hanzo jungle as well as the Lunox gold lane with a Kaja, Cho, and as well as a Xborg. An entire comp dedicated to 2 things. 1, peel. 2, look to pick people off. I mean, what else can you really do about it? We do see that Hanzo actually, towards the late game, become quite a menace, especially with the Homebois lineup. A lot of them, and especially like, what's his face? Warlord, it's clear that he's uncomfortable playing against this Hanzo, because there's a lot of times where you would expect him to know certain movements coming in from the Hanzo, but to actually face it in practice, especially with scrims not having too many Hanzo planers overall, you can see that he's mispositioning himself, he's underestimating the overall damage, and the same can be said about his other counterpart. Where is it? His other counterpart, Ryzel, there we go. For matches that you want to keep in mind for day number 3, it's going to be Team Secret versus Team Secret versus Todak, because Todak decides once again with the experimentation to show off Kaja Jungle, right? And it's not like we haven't seen Kaja Jungle put into practice in other different regions. It's just interesting to see it being practiced here in MPL MY. Because by all means, I would say that Team Secret probably have won the draft from the get-go, but unfortunately their communication breakdown towards the mid and later stages of the game really hurts them. The experience and chemistry amongst these players from the side of Team Secret is only going to get better from here on out, but this is a very low starting point and it's hurting their composition. It's clear that they don't have a dedicated roamer. The fact that they have 2 mid laners in Matt as well as AIM is putting them at odds with a lot of their draft picks, making it super awkward. But I would have to say that the early game is solid. There's just a lot to work on here. But let's bring it back to what we were talking about just now. Kaja Jungle. I wouldn't have expected it to win, but the fact that Todak, it shows that their chemistry and experience with the Langar mentality, their instincts are very aligned with one another. And I think that's what sets them apart from Team Secret in this matchup despite having a losing draft. Moving on, in that same game itself, we see the Jawhead Jungle. We haven't seen this come into meta in forever, but they decided to whip it out here. And when I say decided, they actually made a mistake. Having an interview after winning 2-0 against Team Secret right from their coach's mouth, they meant it, and they said it, that Jawhead was not intentional. But the fact is, they still are just the better team, winning 2-0 against Team Secret. And that's all we have for the daily recap of week number 1 of the MPL MY. Go check out these highlight games in case any of these points actually interest you, or at the very least you kind of want to know what's going on here at the MPL MY. Hopefully I've covered enough for y'all to kind of give you a rough idea of what's going on here in the Malaysian scene at the very least. So I'll see you guys next time.